Okay, so we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Today we'll be taking Sutta number 89 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Dhammacetiya Sutta, which is translated as monuments to the Dhamma. And behind the sutta, indicated by the commentary, there's an important historical event taking place in the ancient history of ancient India. Okay, this sutta takes the form of a conversation between King Pasenadi of Kosala and the Buddha. Kosala was the state in which the Buddha's in which the city of Savatthi was located, and the Buddha's main monastery, Jeta's Grove, was located in the city of Savatthi. And so King Pasenadi had been sort of the patron of the Buddha during most of his teaching career. And the first time that King Pasenadi was exposed to the Buddha's teaching was in the sutta that we examined 2 weeks ago. This is the Piyajatika Sutta, Sutta number 87 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And if you remember, in that sutta, when King Pasenadi first heard a statement reportedly coming from the Buddha that sorrow and suffering arise from those who are dear, he became angry and upset with that saying, and he dismissed his wife, Queen Malika, for her devotion to the Buddha and for her acceptance of that saying. But then, by a kind of ruse, Queen Malika got King Pasenadi to agree with the principle expressed in that saying of the Buddha. And then when Queen Malika pointed out to the king that that was the very same statement that the Buddha was making, then King Pasenadi got down on the ground and he extended his hands in homage and he said, Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Then, as I explained last time, it seems at that point King Pasenadi had not yet actually met the Buddha in person, but his first encounter with the Buddha is recorded in Sutta Nikaya, chapter 3, Sutta number 1, where King Pasenadi came to the Buddha and said, "Do you claim to be a fully enlightened one?" And the Buddha said, "I do." Then King Pasenadi said, "How can you claim to be fully enlightened when you're so young? You're just, probably at that time the Buddha might have been 36, 37 years old, probably shortly after his enlightenment." And the king, normally we would expect somebody who's claiming to be enlightened to have a long gray beard and long gray hair, to be walking with a walking stick. And here it's like, is there anybody here in their middle 30s? How old are you? How old? So you're 34. Okay, so give or take a few years. So suppose you're 36, 37. And you came up to me and you said, I'm fully enlightened one. And I, in my late 60s, would look at this, kid and say, he's claiming to be fully enlightened? No way. So King Pasenadi, at that time, we'll see that he's actually the same age as the Buddha, but he would expect somebody who's fully enlightened to be, considerably older than himself. So he says, how could you claim at such a young age to be fully enlightened? Then the Buddha explained to him that there are 4 things that one shouldn't disparage just because they're young. One is a fire, because the fire could flare up and burn down even a whole village or town. One is a prince who's young, because that prince, if you disparage him, he might be the heir to the throne. So when he becomes king, he'll remember that one disparaged me when I was young. Throw him in prison, torture him, execute him. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that to you. And you're not even making any claims. Okay, the third thing is a snake. If one disparages a little young snake, a viper, then I think that there was a belief in India that snakes will remember what is said, will find out what is said about them. So if one disparages a little snake, a poisonous snake, when that snake grows up and becomes big, he'll try to seek you out and bite you. And then the fourth thing that one shouldn't disparage when they're young is an ascetic, a samana. Because if one disparages the samana, of course he's not going to intentionally do anything harmful to oneself, but by disparaging a samana, if he's happens to be a holy one who's reached one of the stages of awakening, then one generates a heavy type of unwholesome karma which can come back and cause painful consequences for oneself. Okay, so at that point, when the Buddha gave that explanation and then recited the verses, then King Pasenadi gained faith in the Buddha, and he went for refuge. He took the 3 refuges. So from that time on, King Pasenadi frequently would come to see the Buddha when the Buddha was living in Savatthi, and they developed a very close relationship. There's no report that King Pasenadi achieved any of the 4 stages of awakening, not even the stage of stream entry. But still, King Pasenadi was a very devout follower of the Buddha, very generous supporter, and he frequently came to see the Buddha to get advice from the Buddha, to get consolation from the Buddha. Even one time, the Buddha gave King Pasenadi some advice. It seems that the king was overeating, and so he gained a lot of weight. And so when he came to see the Buddha, even though he had to walk a short distance, he was huffing and puffing and out of breath. And so the Buddha gave him some advice on how to lose weight. Yeah, very practical advice. He told him that he should charge one of his attendants with the responsibility when the king is taking his meal. You see, the king was eating, I think the Buddha asked the king, how much rice are you eating? And the king, he expressed this in terms of the Indian measurements of the period. But it would be something like eating a pot of rice. And so the Buddha said, Your Majesty, you have to stop that. You have to reduce the amount of rice you're eating. But the Buddha gave wise advice. He said, don't try to do it suddenly. If you just cut down from a pot of rice to just like a bowl of rice, you won't be able to do it. You're going to get hungry, and then before long, you go off the wagon again. Is that the expression? When somebody is trying to stop drinking, you go off the wagon, and then again you're eating a pot of rice. So rather what the Buddha said is that you tell your attendant, as you're eating your pot of rice, first, when you've eaten 3/4 of the pot, he should come, give you a bowl of water, and take the pot of rice away. Then after you get used to 3/4 of the pot, the attendant should serve you just half a pot of rice. Okay, when you've gotten used to half a pot of rice, then the attendant will come and take the rice away when you've eaten 1/3 of the pot of rice. Then the next time when you've eaten 1/4 of the pot of rice, then the next time he doesn't have to serve you the pot of rice, but he can just put the rice in the bowl, and then you'll be able to eat it, and you'll be accustomed to it. Okay, so that's the Buddha's advice on losing weight. This also comes in the Sutta Nikaya. It's in chapter 3. Anybody who wants to lose weight, I don't remember the number of the sutta, but I think it's called, the name of the sutta is something like a pot of rice. There's only 25 short suttas in chapter 3, so you could find it easily. And if anybody is too thin and wants to gain weight, you might start from the normal size bowl of rice and then work your way up, maybe to 1/3 of a pot. Okay, now this sutta that we're going to take today, this was a conversation between King Pasenadi and the Buddha that takes place when both of them are 80 years old. And we know the Buddha passed away at the age of 80. And we'll see, at least from the notes that are taken from the commentary, that this is actually, though he doesn't know it at the time, this is the last time King Pasenadi is going to meet the Buddha. His last conversation with the Buddha. Okay, so when the sutta opens, the Buddha is living in the Sakyan country at a town of the Sakyans called Medalumpa. Otherwise, it's not mentioned anywhere else that I could think of. And now the Sakyan state was a republic. It was located, as you probably know, in what is now part of Nepal. Perhaps part of it overlaps India. It's in the foothills of the Himalayas. Or actually, it's not really the foothills of the Himalayas. We would say it's at the foot of the Himalayan mountains, but it's still the plain area. And though the Sakyan state was self-administering, a republic, but still it was a kind of protectorate of the kingdom of Kosala. And so King Pasenadi exercised some kind of sovereignty over the Sakyan state, though he didn't directly administer it. It was administered, the Sakyan state was administered by a council of the senior Sakyans. And it seems that in earlier years, the Buddha's father, who's usually said to have been a king, was actually probably the leading elder of the Council of Elders of the Sakyan Republic. Okay, so when the sutta begins, King Pasenadi had arrived at Nagarika for some business or other. Okay, and then he addressed his, I guess this was his chief minister, like his secretary of state, named Diga Karayana, and asked him to go to get the carriages prepared. He wants to go to one of the pleasure gardens to see a pleasing spot. Okay, so Karayana prepares the carriages, and they go out from Nagarika, and they reach a park. This would be like a pleasure garden. And as the king is walking around in this park, he sees the roots of trees, which are said to be lovely and inspiring, quiet, undisturbed by voices, with the atmosphere of seclusion, remote from people, favorable for retreat or for seclusion. And then as he sees this reminds him of the Buddha. And so he reports this to his minister, Karayana, and he asks him, where is the Buddha now living? And so King Diga Karayana reports to the king that the Buddha is now living at the Sakyan town named Medalumpa. How Diga Karayana knows this, I don't know, but there must have been some kind of grapevine of information that he was in on. So he asks, how far is it to Medalumpa? And Karayana replies that it's 3 yojanas. A yojana is said to be somewhere around 6 or 7 miles. So this would be roughly, it could be 20 miles away. And so now, since King Pasenadi is full of this sort of inspired recollection of the Buddha, and he's full of a yearning to see the Buddha, like he hasn't seen the Buddha maybe for several months. And so he says, let's go to Medalumpa and see the Buddha. Okay, so they get the carriages prepared and they set out together from Nagarika towards Medalumpa. Okay, and then apparently out on the outskirts of Medalumpa there must be some sort of vihara or arama, some monastery where the Buddha is living. And so the king gets out from his carriage and he starts proceeding towards this park, and he arrives there while it's still daylight. And then he sees a number of monks walking up and down in the open, and he goes to them and he asks, where is the Buddha living now? I want to see the Blessed One. Then one of the monks points out his kuti, his dwelling place. Actually, it's probably more than a kuti, it's a cottage, probably a little cottage. And the monk tells him that's his dwelling place. And if you want to see him, you can go up to it quietly, enter the porch, clear your throat. That's a way of signaling that a person is present. And then tap on the panel, and then the Buddha will open the door to you. Okay, now here's a very significant sentence that is a key to the underlying sort of the dramatic story that implicitly underlies the sutta. Now when King Pasenadi wants to see the Buddha, he can't be wearing the emblems of royalty, because that would be a kind of display of royal arrogance. And in fact, there's a rule that for the monks, that if a monk is going to preach the Dhamma, the person who's listening shouldn't have a weapon on him and shouldn't be wearing a hat That's because the hats in ancient India, it wasn't something that we wear here, like these kind of caps to keep warm, but it's usually worn, a hat, as a kind of mark of prestige. So it's a show of a person's high position that he's wearing a particular kind of hat. And so the king hands over his sword and turban to his minister, Karayana. And what's significant is that the sword and turban are emblems of royalty. Okay, now, as King Pasenadi goes in to see the Buddha, Digha Karayana thinks to himself, the king is now going into a secret session with the Buddha, and I have to wait here alone. Okay, just as we read those sentences, they might not seem very significant, but as I said, there is an underlying story to this, which is related in a number of commentaries. Okay, now Digha Karayana, who is the minister of King Pasenadi, was the nephew of a man named Bandula. Okay, now Bandula was a chieftain of the people who are called the Malans. And the Mala state, it's a small state in the northeast of India. This edition had a map. Yeah, this edition does have a map. Let's see if the Mala state, yeah. The map is on page 76. You could see the Buddha's own state. The second state is to the north of the Malan state. And Kusinara, the city, the town of Kusinara, where the Buddha passed away, is in the Malan state. And both of them are adjacent to the larger, more powerful state of Kosala. And so at the time that the Buddha lived, these large and powerful monarchies were emerging. The two main monarchies in the northeast of India were the state of Kosala and the state of Magadha. The king of Magadha, the first king, powerful king, was Bimbisara, and he was actually murdered by his son Ajatasattu, who then became the king in the later part of the Buddha's life. And the king of Kosala was King Pasenadi, and Kosala had been absorbing or exercising some kind of sovereignty or protectorship over the Sakyan Republic and the Republic of the Malans. Okay, now Bandula apparently had been a kind of trusted administrator of King Pasenadi. He was a chieftain of the Malans, and apparently King Pasenadi was very fond of him and had a great deal of trust in him. But some of the ministers of King Pasenadi who were close to him were jealous of Bandula. And so what they did was to conspire to poison King Pasenadi's mind, to make him suspicious of Bandula. And so, you know the way people can spread rumors. Like on one occasion, one minister would go to the king and tell him, you know, Bandula has been up to this and that. On another occasion, another minister would come and say, you know, I heard Bandula talking to some of his own people and they're plotting to break away from you. And then another would come and say, you know, recently I got some word from so-and-so that Bandula is planning to revolt against you. And another one would say, I heard Bandula is planning to have you assassinated. And so when King Pasenadi heard this coming from different people, he thought, it's either me or Bandula, and it ain't going to be me. And so he arranged to murder Bandula and a number of, I think they were nephews of Bandula. I forgot the exact number. Yeah, he had Bandula killed together with his 32 sons. Okay, now, Diga Karayana was a nephew of Bandula. And he had resentment against King Pasenadi for killing his uncle and so many of his cousins. It seems a little strange that King Pasenadi would appoint as a minister the nephew of somebody that he's killed, but perhaps the king didn't know of their relationship. Or perhaps he thought Karayana was trustworthy. Actually, Karayana was the commander-in-chief of the king's army. He was the Senapati, like the general in charge of the army. And so now when King Pasenadi went to see the Buddha, according to the commentary, Karayana was afraid that the king was going to plot with the Buddha, form a plot with the Buddha to have himself killed. Maybe the Buddha, he was afraid the Buddha's going to tell the king, your commander-in-chief is the nephew of Bandula. He's not trustworthy, get him killed. And so Karayana became afraid. Especially he was waiting here alone, and maybe he thinks King Pasenadi is going to come out, and then he's going to ask for his sword back, and then he's going to kill me. And so according to the commentary, what Karayana did was to hand over the crown or the turban and the sword to King Pasenadi's son, who was a general named Vidudaba. And by doing this, what he is doing in effect is handing over the emblems of sovereignty to the king's son, to the prince, making the prince the king in his place. I think according to the commentary, Karayana set off to go back to the city of Savatthi and gave those emblems to Viduddhapa and had him crowned king in Pasenadi's absence. The king's son is named Viduddhapa. It's a rather strange name. And you know, in India, at least in ancient India, kings would always want to beget sons in order to have heirs to the throne. But so often it happened in Indian history that the son who was the heir to the throne would usurp the throne from his father and have his father imprisoned or killed. This happened in the state of Magadha when Prince Ajatasattu overthrew his father, the very pious King Bimbisara, had him imprisoned and killed. And Viduddhapa is going to take over the kingdom from his father, King Pasenadi, and lock the gates to the city so Pasenadi won't be able to enter again. Okay, so at this point, it seems Karayana leaves the scene and goes back to Savatthi to hand the emblems of royalty over to the Prince Viduddhapa. Okay, so while this act of treachery or treason is going on, King Pasenadi goes up to the dwelling of the Buddha, taps on the door, and then the Buddha opens the door. And then King Pasenadi enters the dwelling, and now he prostrates himself with his head at the Buddha's feet. This is the usual sign of respect. But this time he goes even further, and he covers the Buddha's feet with kisses and caresses them with his hands, and he declares out loud, "I am King Pasenadi of Kosala. I am King Pasenadi of Kosala." This is a kind of act, I guess, in the culture of that period. It signifies, it shows complete humility, complete surrender to a spiritual teacher. And then the Buddha asked the king, "What is your reason for showing such homage, supreme homage, to to this body, and for showing such friendship?" You can see that the Buddha is somewhat detached from that act of homage and humility. So he says it's something that's done to this body. Okay, and now King Pasenadi is going to praise the Buddha in terms of 10 qualities that he can observe in the Buddha and in the Sangha. So he declares out loud first, he expresses his faith that the Buddha is, or the Blessed One, is fully enlightened, the Dharma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, and the Sangha of the Buddha's disciples is practicing the good way. Okay, so this is his statement of faith, his statement of confidence. And now he's going to give 10 reasons for this confidence, for facts, for observations that he's made on the basis of which he is able to declare his trust, such trust in the three jewels. Okay, I have to put on my reading glasses. Okay, he says, okay, the first one, he says, "Now, Venerable Sir, I see some ascetics and Brahmins leading what is called a limited holy life for 10 years, 20, 30, 40 years. And then on a later occasion, I see them well-groomed and well-anointed. Now they've grown their hair, or if they had the long hair, they've had it trimmed neatly. And if they were shaving the face, now they've grown beards. You know, they would be well-groomed beards, and they're enjoying themselves, provided and endowed with the 5 objects of sensual pleasure." In other words, even though they've lived the ascetic life even for as long as 40 years, so assuming that they've entered the ascetic life at the age of 20, now they're 60 years old, so now they might have been going around with loincloths and with long matted hair and beards and practicing austerities, wandering over the country all alone or in small groups, fasting, sleeping out in the open on cold nights. Now at the age of 60, they're going out to high-class restaurants. They have their iPad, and maybe they're holding hands with their girlfriend or with their wife, and wearing, what are some of the finest Italian suits. Okay, but he says, "Here I see the bhikkhus leading the perfect and pure holy life as long as their life and breath lasts." And so therefore he says, "Indeed, I do not see any other spiritual life elsewhere as perfect and pure as this." And it's a very beautiful testament of praise on the part of King Pasenadi. But as one who's lived as a monk for some 20 years in Sri Lanka, I have to say, wait a minute, King Pasenadi. Hold your horses. I know a few things that you don't know. But I haven't even lived in Thailand. But even on the basis of the suttas themselves, there's a sutta we would have taken, maybe a few months ago. Let's see, it's number 77. I'll get the page number in a moment. It's page 631. No, it's actually on the top of 632. Here it's the wanderer named Sakaludai who is praising the Buddha, and he says, "Even those disciples of his who fall out with their companions in the holy life and abandon the training to return to what's called the low life, or this is the household life, even they continue to praise the Master, that's the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and then they blame themselves for giving up the monastic life. And they say that we were unlucky, we had little merit, it's our own fault that we couldn't continue to live this excellent holy life. And then they become monastery attendants or lay followers, and they observe the 5 precepts. So we find from this sutta that there's evidence that some of the Buddha's monastic disciples would give up the training and return to lay life. But there's also evidence in the suttas that some of the disciples who left the Buddha, the monastic disciples who gave up the monastic life, didn't always praise the Buddha. For example, Sutta number 12, which I think we took a long time ago, is the case of a man named Sunakata. This is on page 164, who had been a monk under the Buddha. Then he always wanted the Buddha to perform what we would call miracles, feats of supernatural power. And the Buddha refused to perform feats of supernatural power just to please the curiosity of this insistent disciple. And so Sunakata kept on getting angrier with the Buddha, getting upset with him. Why doesn't the Buddha perform a feat of supernatural power? Probably he's just an ordinary person. He doesn't have any realization. Then he gave up the monastic life, and then he went around. He was from the city of Vesali, and so he went around in the city of Vesali saying, on page 164, paragraph 2, the ascetic Gautama doesn't have any kind of superhuman states, any excellent knowledge and vision. He teaches a Dhamma which he has just worked out through his own reasoning, following his own line of inquiry. And the most it will do is to lead one who practices it to complete destruction of suffering, but not to any kind of supernatural powers. Okay, so even during the Buddha's lifetime, there actually, this is just one example, but there were several examples of disciples who left the Buddha and then complained about him and belittled him afterwards. And so King Pasenadi is speaking a little bit let's say beyond his experience here. But perhaps we could say that the king would have observed that there were many distinguished people who became disciples under the Buddha and continued to live the monastic life through their entire life. Okay, so he says that this is one reason why I infer according to Dhamma, or I infer reasonably, that the Buddha is perfectly enlightened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed, the Sangha is practicing the good path. Okay, then the king says the next ground for his confidence, he sees kings quarrel with kings, nobles quarrel with nobles. This is kshatriyas with kshatriyas, Brahmins with Brahmins, householders with householders, mother with son, father with son, brother with brother, sister with brother, friend with friend. Okay, so he sees in the ordinary society conflicts even within a family. But he says, here I see the monks living in concord with mutual appreciation, without disputes, blending like milk and water, viewing each other with kindly eyes, and I don't see any other assembly elsewhere with such harmony. So that, he says, that is my second reason for uttering such praise of the Buddha. Again, I have to say, wait a second, Your Majesty. Aren't you familiar with the famous story of the great dispute at Kosambi? We came across that, again, it must have been several months ago. Sutta number 48 in the Majjhima Nikaya. Okay, this is page 419. Okay, on the occasion, the Buddha was living at Kosambi in Gosita's park. Now, on that occasion, the monks at Kosambi had taken to quarreling and brawling and were deep in disputes, stabbing each other with verbal daggers. They couldn't convince one another, they couldn't persuade one another. Okay, so they complains. One monk goes to the Buddha and complains. The Buddha tries to reconcile them. Well, here it seems the Buddha gives them some instructions to reestablish harmony, but there's another Sutta 128, I believe. This is again referring to the quarrel at Kosambi where the monks are deep in dispute. Then the Buddha comes to them and tries to reconcile them, and the monks who are fighting with each other tell the Buddha, in fact they say, "Listen, Master, you go back to your hut and you sit there and you meditate peacefully. This is our business. We're going to settle this ourselves." And then the Buddha gets so disappointed by the monks that he takes his bowl and robe, he utters some voices saying how these monks have now become fools, and then the Buddha goes off, wanders and goes off to live someplace quietly by himself. Okay, so, and then if you read the Vinaya Pitaka, you see that, that there are quite a few occasions where the monks fight with each other, and so the Buddha had to set up guidelines to prevent disputes within the Sangha and principles of harmony and respect, so the monks would live together harmoniously. And I'm not making this up, and I'm not drawing upon the Jain scriptures or the Brahmanic texts. This is what the Buddhist texts themselves say about conditions in the Sangha during the Buddha's time. Okay, but we could say generally, and let us say this is the Buddha's time. Afterwards, we have numbers of sects in Buddhism. I mean, not to speak of the divide of the early Sangha into 18 sects. Then there came a big division between the followers of the early Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, the number of sects in Mahayana Buddhism. Then even in Theravada Buddhism, there were divisions into a number of, within Sri Lanka, to 3 or 4 sects or lineages, generally because of very minor points in the Vinaya, or places of ordination, the origin of ordination. Okay, the third point. Okay, the king says, this is paragraph 12, "I have walked and wandered from park to park, from garden to garden." He's actually not referring to like flower gardens, but what's meant here are the kind of places that were set aside in India outside the towns and villages where the wandering sadhus, the monks, the ascetics, the renunciants, the sannyasis would go to stay as they're traveling around the country. And he says, "There I have seen some recluses and Brahmins who are lean, wretched, unsightly, jaundiced, with veins standing out on their limbs, such that people wouldn't want to look at them again." Has anybody been to India and seen some of the ascetics in the towns of India? You've been? And seen the ascetics? You see many of them, they undertake extreme fasts, and so their body's very, very thin. And if you've seen the Shaivite ascetics, they're not thin, they're very powerful, very strong, very powerful, and they go naked, or else they wear just the loincloth, and they have, the Shaivite marking, I think it's the lines that go horizontally on the forehead. Excuse me? Yeah. That's the Shaivites are horizontal. The Vaishnavites, devotees of Vishnu, have something like this, I think, on the forehead. And then the Shaivites, at least some of the sects, they carry this trident. They call it the trident. It's like a pitchfork with 3 points on it. And they usually travel in troops and groups. And if you see them, pretty scary. I haven't seen, though I've been in India, I don't think I've seen them in real life, but I've seen photographs of them. If I remember, there was a photographic book. It's probably still available. I think it's called Sadhus. It's photographs of different types of ascetics in India. And you see some of the ascetics, they sit on these seats made out of spikes, and other ascetics take the vow always to keep one leg lifted, so they hang on to the branch of a tree, keeping one leg up in the air till, the blood, it seems that something happens to the circulation, so the body starts to turn a kind of yellowish color or sometimes a bluish color. And so I say that there's a real difference in appearance. And if I've seen the